What happens when a billionaire CEO boards a flight in silence and is told to move for the sake of someone else's comfort? No shouting, no viral clapback, just one man, one seat, and a refusal to be erased. This isn't the story of a scandal. It's the story of a moment that began with prejudice, but ended with policy, with a quiet choice that grounded an entire airline, shook corporate boardrooms, and sparked change across the country. But who was this man who didn't raise his voice, yet made the world listen? Why did one woman's designer bag become the symbol of a much deeper divide? And when dignity is denied in plain view, how does one hold power without ever standing up? This is not just about race, not just about class. It's about quiet strength, about legacy, and about the seat we're all told to give up until someone finally refuses. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been asked to shrink, this story is for you. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And let's begin the story of Malcolm Royce. The sun had just begun to spill through the tall glass walls of Terminal 9 at Charleston International Airport, bathing the sleek marble floors in amber light. It was barely 6:10 Mom. Yet the air already buzzed with the low murmur of early travelers, the soft hum of suitcase wheels, the occasional clink of espresso cups, the rhythmic voice of overhead announcements. Gate 47 was preparing for Flight AV626 to San Francisco. First class was nearly full. Suits pressed, heels polished, earbuds in. Most didn't speak. They didn't need to. These were the high performers, the polished elite, boarding a Monday morning flagship route for deals, mergers, tech demos, and federal panels. Time wasn't money to them. Time was dominance. Outside the windows, the tarmac glinted with morning dew. Ground crew in neon vests moved like clockwork, guiding carts, fueling the aircraft, prepping what would appear to most passengers as just another routine departure. Inside the terminal, however, quiet shifts in energy had already begun. A woman stood near the first-class gate with her arms crossed. Paige Whitmore. Blonde, sculpted, poised. Her cream-colored blazer matched her quilted handbag, a limited-edition Le Mirage worth more than most domestic round trips. Her presence alone seemed to signal something territorial. Paige had arrived early, not out of necessity, but for control. She always liked to be the first in the lounge, the first to board, the first to set the tone. She tapped lightly at her phone, scrolling through news headlines and group texts from her Charleston circle. One of them sent a photo of their lakeside brunch. She smiled faintly, then looked up. People were gathering now. An older man in an elegant navy trench coat, a young woman in all black with an Aerovista Platinum card clipped to her lanyard. Paige's gaze lingered only a moment on each, as if evaluating their relevance, then moved on. She did not expect to be challenged this morning. She certainly didn't expect him. Down the terminal corridor, a tall figure walked with measured steps. Crisp charcoal suit, rolled leather carry-on, a stillness in his posture that drew attention without seeking it. The man paused briefly near a window, checking his phone, and then continued toward Gate 47. Some noticed him, others did not, but the flight attendants did. Behind the desk. Elena Cruz looked up from her tablet and caught his approach. Something in her paused, not in fear, not in awe, but in recognition. She had only met him once in a boardroom, months ago, during an internal training video review. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't needed to. "Is that?" she whispered, barely audible. The other attendant glanced, shrugged. "Just another exec." "No," Elena said softly. "Not just." He handed over his boarding pass. His voice was low, warm. "Good morning." "Good morning, sir," Eleanor replied, clearing her throat quickly. "You're in seat 2B. He nodded once. "Thank you." As he stepped onto the jet bridge, Eleanor's eyes lingered a moment longer than they should have. She glanced down at the name printed in the system, Malcolm Royce. She knew who he was now. Everyone in Aerovista did if they paid attention. Chairman and CEO of Aerovista Holdings, media shy, privately revered, and the architect behind one of the most comprehensive industry reforms in modern aviation. He rarely flew commercial. When he did, it wasn't to make statements. It was to observe. And no one ever noticed him until it was too late. Inside the cabin, everything gleamed. First class on the AV626 Dreamliner was its own world. Mood lighting, white leather seating with ashwood panels, individual privacy partitions, champagne already poured for early boarders, an air of cultivated calm, where even flight attendants moved quieter than usual. At seat 2A, Paige Whitmore had already made herself comfortable. Her Le Mirage handbag was stretched across both 2A and 2B, placed in a way that made it obvious she didn't intend to move it. Her coat was folded neatly over the divider. She didn't even look up when Malcolm Royce entered the cabin. He walked in silence, nodded politely to a crew member, then stopped. Seat 2B, his seat, already claimed not by a passenger, but by a handbag. He looked at it, then at Paige. For a beat, he waited. Surely, this was a mistake. But Paige didn't flinch. She took a sip of her champagne and glanced at him sideways, as if just noticing someone had entered her airspace. He spoke gently. "Excuse me, I believe you've placed your bag on my seat." She tilted her head, her smile subtle but sharp. "This seat's taken," she said coolly. "Try checking with the attendant. Maybe they can get you a spot in economy." Her words weren't loud, but they were designed to be heard. The man in 3D glanced up. A couple in row 1 exchanged a look. Malcolm said nothing at first. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his suit and held out his boarding pass. 2B, clear, printed, valid. Paige did not look at it. Instead, she narrowed her eyes, measuring his posture, his presence. Her silence said more than her words ever could. "You don't belong here, and I don't have to explain why I think so." Eleanor Cruz, standing just behind the divider, noticed the tension too late. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked. Malcolm nodded, softly. "Yes, just a seating misunderstanding." He kept his voice calm, always calm. But Eleanor's stomach twisted. She saw the pass in his hand. She saw the bag sprawled across the seat. She saw the subtle indignation in Paige's shoulders, not alarm, not confusion, ownership. "I'm sure we can resolve this," Elena said quickly. "I'm sure we can," Malcolm replied, smiling politely. "Though I'm not sure the misunderstanding is mine," behind his even tone. Elena heard something else, something that wasn't anger, but a kind of deliberate watchfulness, the kind of stillness before a wave breaks. She knew then. This morning would not go as expected. None of them had any idea what kind of turbulence had just entered the cabin, and it wasn't from the weather outside. Malcolm didn't sit, not yet. He remained standing beside seat 2B, the laminated boarding pass still between his fingers, the smile still lingering on his face, the kind of expression that said, "I've been here before." Not just in location, in experience. He glanced once more at the handbag sprawled across the seat, then at Paige. She had already turned her attention back to her phone, scrolling like nothing had happened. The signal was clear. "You're not meant to be here, and I don't need to say it louder." The cabin buzzed faintly, with that quiet energy of discomfort, the kind that made people pretend to sleep or check emails that didn't exist. 2 rows back. Jared Banks watched with a tightening jaw. He'd recognized Malcolm the moment he stepped on board, even if no one else had. Or maybe they had, but chose to ignore it. Jared had built startups before. He knew how perception worked. He'd seen boardrooms shrink when the only black man walked in, or how credit shifted with just a name. But this, on a plane, with him, Malcolm Royce, this wasn't ignorance. This was design. "Elena," Malcolm said quietly now, "I don't want to escalate, but I would like to sit down." Elena Cruz looked at him, then at Paige. "Ms. Whitmore?" she asked gently, her voice carefully professional. "That seat is assigned. I'll be happy to help you reposition your bag." Paige didn't look up. "I told him it was taken," she said flatly. "He can sit elsewhere." Helena blinked. "But this is his assigned. He's making a scene." Paige interrupted. Louder this time. "I feel unsafe." The word struck like an unexpected slap. Passengers stirred. Heads turned more obviously now. Phones shifted. Someone near the bulkhead started recording, subtly at first. Malcolm said nothing. His heart beat once heavy, then again, but his expression didn't move. "Unsafe," Elena repeated, barely above a whisper. "He hasn't." "You heard me," Paige snapped. "He's aggressive, demanding. I don't feel comfortable with him standing over me like this." It was a well-placed dagger, sharp, practiced. Malcolm looked down, letting the moment wash over him. He inhaled slowly through his nose and held it. He'd seen this before. Not this seat, not this woman, but this performance. A younger version of himself might have responded, might have demanded, might have raised his voice just enough to validate her accusation, but not today. He thought of his mother for a moment, of how she taught him when he was just 7 years old, and the neighbor across the street had accused him of stealing a basketball. His own basketball, 'cause a boy like him shouldn't have one that new. "Let your silence be louder than their fear," she'd whispered to him that night. "Let your stillness rattle them." So he nodded. "Elena," he said again, calmly, "if it helps ease the tension, I'll wait in the jet bridge." She looked stunned. "Mr. Royce, you shouldn't have to, but I will." He cut in gently, "Because it's not about this seat anymore." He turned, careful, deliberate. He tucked his boarding pass back into his pocket and walked slowly to the front of the cabin. Paige exhaled, victorious. She reclined again, reclaiming the space like it was rightfully hers. The Le Mirage bag still sat, triumphant, across 2B, a luxury blockade. As Malcolm stepped back into the muted lighting of the jet bridge, the air seemed heavier. He could still hear the faint hum of the engines. He turned and walked 3 quiet steps away from the door. Then he paused. He didn't sigh. He didn't blink. He simply reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a Fomat Black, unmarked. He pressed a number on speed dial. It connected instantly. "This is Royce," he said. His voice didn't need volume. It carried gravity. "Initiate protocol, Halcyon." There was a pause on the other end. Then understood. Surveillance in motion. Malcolm hung up. The world wouldn't shift today because he shouted. It would shift because he didn't. Back inside the cabin, Eleanor returned to the galley. Her hands trembled slightly as she tapped the crew terminal. She knew something was wrong. Deeply wrong. She could feel it in the air. She glanced down the aisle and caught Jared looking at her. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. "I saw everything," he mouthed silently. Elena nodded once. She had 2. Meanwhile, Page scrolled again. News headlines, stock tickers, unread texts. She ignored the subtle chill in the air. She assumed the moment had passed. She assumed she had won. But the ripple had already started. In an operations center 2 time zones away, Carmen Lee sipped her first coffee of the day. A notification blinked across her screen. Protocol Halcyon activated. Flight AV626. She sat up straighter. Behind her, an entire wall of screens illuminated with flight maps, system diagnostics, and real-time crew data. She didn't need a memo to understand what it meant. Malcolm Royce had been underestimated again, and that was always a mistake. Carmen stood and addressed her team. Begin Phase 1. Across the terminal, boarding announcements continued as if nothing had changed. Across the world, flights took off without knowing what was coming. But inside Gate 47, something irreversible had already begun. The kind of moment people don't realize they're witnessing until it's over, until the system stalls. The hashtags trend, the press releases scramble, and people look back and ask, how did it all begin with a bag on a seat and a man who chose not to sit? From the outside, Flight AV626 still looked ordinary. Gate agents at the terminal continued processing travelers. The airport lounge bustled with murmured phone calls, latos, and last-minute gate changes. Screens blinked from blue to red and back again. But inside the cabin, specifically inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, but deeply. Passengers sensed it. A disruption had occurred, and it wasn't turbulence, nor a delay, nor a mechanical issue. It was something subtler, a wrongness people couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. Elena Cruz stood at the front galley, nervously retying her ponytail for the 3rd time. She tried to steady her breath. The words Page had used still echoed in her ears. He's making a scene. I feel unsafe. It wasn't the first time Elena had heard those phrases on a flight, but it was the first time they were being used against a man whose calm presence had made her feel safer, not more threatened. Everything okay? Elena, a voice asked behind her. She turned. Mark Dellinger, the lead purser, stood there with a clipboard in hand and a practiced calm in his voice. Mid-50s, steel-gray hair, perfectly knotted tie. He had spent 3 decades managing the subtle chaos of air travel, but this morning he already looked 2 beats behind. There's a seating issue in 2B, Elena said. He frowned. Misbooking, no. The passenger in 2B Imster, Malcolm Royce, was asked to wait outside. Mark's pen paused above his checklist. Wait outside, he repeated. Why Elena hesitated, then lowered her voice. Because Ms. Whitmore said she didn't feel safe. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. And did he give her any reason to feel that way? Elena said quickly, not even slightly. He was respectful, calm. He just wanted to sit. Mark closed his eyes for a brief second, not because he was surprised, but because he wasn't. Okay, he said finally. Let me speak with her. As Mark moved down the aisle, Elena watched his posture carefully. He wasn't just walking toward a passenger. He was walking into a moment that could change everything. Paige was sipping her 2nd glass of champagne when Mark reached her seat. Miss Whitmore, he said gently. She looked up, barely feigning surprise. Yes, I understand there's been some confusion over the seating, Mark said. May I help reposition your bag so Mr. Royce can take his assigned place in 2B? Paige didn't blink. I already explained to the other attendant, she said. Voice clipped. I feel uncomfortable with him. I don't want to share a row with someone who—" She paused. Let the implication hang. Mark didn't take the bait. "I understand. But Mr. Royce holds a first-class ticket, and we are required." He was aggressive. She cut in, and standing over me. It was intimidating. From seat 3D. Jared Banks exhaled audibly. He couldn't help it. Mark turned his head. Sir Jared didn't look away. "I've been watching since he walked on," he said. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't intimidating. He asked for his seat. Mark gave a slight nod, then turned back to Paige. "This may be difficult. Ms. Whitmore," he said, his tone cooler now. "But unless there's a legitimate safety issue, we cannot displace a confirmed passenger." Paige stiffened. "You're siding with him, I'm siding with procedure," Mark replied. But they both knew it was more than that. The silence between them was loaded. Meanwhile, outside the aircraft, Malcolm Royce remained motionless in the jet bridge. The hum of fluorescent lighting above him felt almost too loud now. He didn't move, didn't pace, just stood there, hands gently wrapped around the handle of his briefcase. His phone buzzed softly. He glanced down. A message from Carmen Lee. Observation logs compiling. Cabin audio loop secured. Initial witness flag marked. Phase 1 completed. Malcolm didn't respond. He slipped the phone back into his jacket and let the moments stretch. He remembered something his mentor once told him back when Malcolm was a 29-year-old consultant standing in front of a room full of executives who assumed he was the AV tech. There are times when you speak because you must, and times when you stay silent because your silence is louder than any speech. This was the latter. Back in the cabin, Paige was starting to notice something she hadn't expected. The looks. Passengers who moments ago were indifferent now glanced at her with quiet disapproval, subtle but unmistakable. A woman in 1C adjusted her scarf and leaned toward her husband. "He just wanted to sit," she whispered. Her husband nodded, tight-lipped. Paige flushed, then glanced back toward Elna, who was speaking quietly to Mark again. "He's still waiting outside?" Mark asked. Elna nodded. "He volunteered," she said. Didn't raise his voice, didn't protest. Mark sighed. His job was to enforce comfort and compliance, not justice. But sometimes those weren't the same. He looked at Elena. "We need to bring him back." At that same moment, another message arrived at Carmen Lee's command center. Flight manifest integrity confirmed. External communications scrubbed. System latency injection ready. Begin delay conditioning. Carmen instructed. Behind her, technicians at Aerovista HQ began adjusting internal logs, injecting subtle lags into Regalia Airline's back-end systems, flight scheduling, baggage claim relays. Gate pushback protocols all began to stutter by milliseconds. It was unnoticeable. For now. But Malcolm Royce hadn't just created Protocol Halcyon as a failsafe. He'd created it as a mirror, to reveal what systems truly looked like when fairness wasn't optional. Elena walked to the front of the aircraft and opened the jet bridge door. Malcolm was still there, still calm. "Sir," she said softly, "we're ready for you to return." Malcolm nodded once, didn't speak. He stepped back on board. The hush that fell over the cabin was deafening. Everyone was watching. Paige stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Malcolm returned to row 2. He didn't look at her, didn't glare, didn't flex his power. He simply picked up the Le Mirage bag, handed it gently to Elena, and sat down. That was it. But it said everything. Malcolm Royce sat in seat 2B. It was a simple act, one that should have gone unnoticed on any other flight, in any other cabin. But not today. Not after what had happened. Not after what hadn't. Paige Whitmore remained beside him in 2A. Her body stiffened, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She hadn't said a word since his return, but her silence wasn't neutral. It pulsed with indignation, as if the presence of this man beside her was a personal insult, not an error corrected. Her Le Mirage bag, now held awkwardly on her lap, had lost its throne. The champagne flute in her other hand quivered ever so slightly. Passengers around them were no longer feigning disinterest. They weren't watching the screens or reading their newspapers. They were waiting for something, for someone. Because even though Malcolm had taken his seat, the story had already begun writing itself, and stories like this rarely ended in peace. From the back galley, Elena Cruz stood watching the first-class cabin through a small slit in the curtain. She didn't feel relief. She felt dread. The moment Malcolm sat down, everything became real, not theoretical, not policy-driven, not something you could file in an incident report and forget. This was something else. Elena knew why. It wasn't just what Paige had said. I feel unsafe. It was how everyone else had responded. No pushback. No support for Malcolm. Just silence. A silence they all shared, until it was convenient not to, and she was one of them. Her stomach twisted. She wanted to say something. To him, to someone, anything. But the words stuck. As always. It was easier to pretend nothing had happened than to risk being the one who acknowledged that it had. In seat 3C, Jared Banks tapped a few lines into his phone. He wasn't trying to start a war, but his conscience wouldn't let him stay quiet either. He posted a tweet. First-class passenger forced to give up seat. Guess what? He's the CEO of the airline, and he handled it with more grace than anyone deserved. AV626. Class lines. Speak truth. He wasn't even sure it would get traction. Until the notification started. Quick, then constant, 3 rows ahead. Paige adjusted her sunglasses, pretending not to notice. But she did. She could hear the murmurs, the subtle shift in tone, the shift in power. This wasn't supposed to happen. She'd been the authority in the room, the one whose comfort mattered, whose word carried weight. That's how it had always been. Charleston dinner parties, charity luncheons, private schools, board seats she didn't earn but inherited. But now this. A man she tried to erase with a few choice phrases had not only returned, but sat taller even in stillness than she ever had. It unsettled her, more than she wanted to admit, more than she ever would. Her fingers hovered over her own phone. She debated texting her family lawyer. She typed half a message, then deleted it. No, not yet. At Aerovista's East Coast Command Center, Carmen Lee was already 3 steps ahead. Pull all internal cabin feeds, she ordered. Her team moved like a silent orchestra. Efficient, focused, run facial ID, Carmen continued. Cross-check the manifest. I want passenger sentiment analytics mapped in the next 10 minutes. Keyword filters active on external social feeds. A junior analyst looked up. Should we scrub the trending hashtags? Carmen shook her head. Let it build, because she knew something Paige didn't. The most powerful backlash wasn't legal. It was cultural, and Airvesta didn't need to speak for Malcolm Royce. The world would. Back on the plane, Mark Dellinger approached Malcolm quietly. Mr. Royce, he said in a lowered voice, leaning down respectfully, I want to personally apologize for how things were handled. Malcolm looked up. His eyes were calm, but tired. Not physically tired. Tired of moments like this. He nodded. Thank you. Mark hesitated. I should have intervened earlier, he said. I let policy get in the way of what was right. Malcolm gave a small smile. You're not the first, he replied, and unfortunately, I don't think you'll be the last. Mark straightened. The words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Up front, the captain exited the cockpit. He conferred with Elena near the galley. What's going on? He asked. There was a seating conflict, she whispered, and a discriminatory escalation. It involved Mr. Royce. The captain blinked. Malcolm Royce. Elena nodded. The captain's jaw tightened. His hands instinctively went to the comm unit clipped at his belt. How bad it's going viral? The captain didn't answer. He knew what this meant. In-flight conflict was routine. In-flight conflict involving that man. There was a corporate earthquake. He tapped his comm unit. Gate ops. This is Captain Reynolds. I need immediate contact with Regalia Airlines HQ, executive level. Paige heard it. That name? Regalia Airlines HQ? She tilted her head slightly. Wait. Regalia. That was Aerovista's top-tier corporate brand. Her fingers began searching. Quickly. She opened Google, typed in Malcolm Royce. The results hit like a gut punch. Chairman and CEO. Aerovista Holdings founder of Halcyon Equity Fortune's quiet titan of aviation. Her skin flushed. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just an executive. This was the owner. The man she told to try economy. The man whose presence she had treated like an inconvenience. Her gaze slid sideways to him. He sat still, eyes closed now. Not asleep, just centered. And suddenly she realized something terrifying. He hadn't fought back because he didn't need to. Meanwhile, in the back cabin, phones were buzzing. The tweet from Jared Banks had been picked up by a travel blogger, then a reporter, then a verified account, in under 20 minutes. The hashtags were trending. Washer Royce returns. Your flight sinks 26. Drew Karen in first. CEO in coach, Drew Privilege, in Ozil 2. Mark Dellinger checked his own phone. Notifications exploded across his screen. He looked up. The captain walked toward him, whispering something quickly. Mark nodded grimly, then turned to Elena. We're not going anywhere. What HQ is delaying? Pushback, he said. They're grounding this flight pending a full internal review. Elena froze. You mean? Mark didn't answer, but the implication was clear. This wasn't just a flight delay. This was a reckoning. Back in 2B, Malcolm opened his eyes. He hadn't moved in minutes, hadn't spoken, but he felt it. The shift. He knew this story would outgrow the plane. He knew Paige had just read about who he was. He also knew that didn't matter anymore. Because this wasn't about who he was. It was about who they all chose to be when no one was looking. And now, everyone was. The plane hadn't moved in 26 minutes. The flight crew said nothing. The engines remained silent. But everyone in first class could feel it, the energy shifting beneath the calm. Phones buzzed nonstop. Hashtags swirled on social feeds faster than the beverage cart ever could. Passengers shared knowing glances, and some pretended not to look at all. But everyone knew. Something had changed. They were no longer just passengers on a delayed flight. They were witnesses to something larger than a seat, to something older than protocol. And in 2B, Malcolm Royce sat motionless, the hum of the aircraft surrounding him like static. Outside the windows, the sun had risen higher over Charleston's skyline. Light streamed across the tarmac, sharp and clear. But inside the cabin, it was as though the air itself had thickened. Elena Cruz wiped her hands on her uniform, fingers trembling. She'd been on over 400 flights in her career, seen passengers scream, cry, collapse. but this was the first time she felt truly complicit by staying quiet. She glanced toward Malcolm. He wasn't watching her. He wasn't watching anyone. His eyes were closed again, one hand resting over the small clasp of his briefcase. She wanted to walk over. She wanted to say something. But what I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. Not anymore. Mark Dellinger's phone vibrated for the 5th time in 2 minutes. The display read, Victor Drummond, Regalia Airways HQ. He stepped into the front galley and took the call. Mark, I want your honest account. Victor's voice barked, sharp and tight. I need to know exactly what happened. Mark lowered his voice. There was a conflict. A woman in 2A claimed she didn't feel safe. He didn't say anything threatening. He never even raised his voice. You removed him from his seat? No. He removed himself. Voluntarily. Then waited until the situation de-escalated. Only then did he return. And you're sure this was Mr. Royce Mark's jaw tightened. I've met him once, at a safety panel. He's not someone you forget. There was silence on the line. Then Jesus Christ. And another pause. Victor's voice dropped. Softer now. Is he still on board? He is. Then listen to me. From this moment forward, you follow his lead. No one touches him. No one talks to him unless he initiates. If he asks for anything, you give it. Mark exhaled slowly. What about the woman? There was no answer. Then a clipped instruction. Hold the flight. Ground all link departures. We're initiating Level 3 protocol. The line went dead. Across the country in Seattle, the Aerovista boardroom lit up with activity. Carmen Lee stood before a massive projection wall as analysts and techs filtered live data. Cross-platform engagement is peaking, one engineer said. Sentiment tracking is over 85% pro-Royce. Global reach? Carmen asked. Just crossed 9.3 million impressions. Is legal online. They've been drafting a risk management statement since boarding. Carmen tapped her tablet. Delay Regalia departures at LAX, JFK, and O'Hare. Begin soft stall procedures. I want the entire network to feel this. One of the execs looked up. Won't that cause chaos? No, Carmen replied, eyes never leaving the screen. That is the point. Malcolm's phone buzzed against his thigh. He didn't need to check it. He knew what it said. Everything was in motion now, not because he ordered it out of ego, but because the system required pressure to be seen clearly. Silence hadn't worked. Politeness hadn't worked. Neither had decorum, but disruption that made people listen. He leaned back, breathing in slowly, and in that moment, an image came to him, one he hadn't seen in years, a memory. He was 12. Standing in the foyer of a museum in Savannah with his father, a man who wore quiet like armor. They'd driven 2 hours to see a traveling exhibit on the Harlem Renaissance. But at the ticket counter, the white clerk had leaned forward, looked past Malcolm's father, and asked, Are you sure this is the right place? Malcolm remembered the pause. His father didn't argue, didn't plead. He took Malcolm's hand, turned around, and left. They sat in the car for nearly a full minute, engine off. Then his father finally spoke. Sometimes they don't say you don't belong. They just act like you never arrived. Malcolm had never forgotten it. Not the words, not the wait, and not the vow he made in that silence that he would never walk out the way his father had. He would stay. He would sit, and he would be seen. Back in the present, Paige Whitmore tapped her fingernails nervously against her glass. She had stopped pretending everything was fine. The subtle tremble in her hand betrayed her. She could see the looks now, the discomfort in people's eyes. The phones recording from peripheral angles, Her instinct screamed, defend yourself. Spin it. Explain. Cry if needed. She'd seen it done before. But deep down, she knew. There wasn't a version of this story that would make her look right anymore. She had made a choice to dismiss a man with authority in his face, dignity in his stance, and restraint in his tone. And now, the world had receipts. She tried again to text her attorney. No signal. No one to run to. In seat 1D, Cynthia Robbins, retired federal judge, 81 years old, with silver curls and sharper instincts than most prosecutors, tapped her cane once against the floor. The gesture caught Elena's attention. Cynthia leaned slightly forward, and when Elena came near, she whispered, "You'll forgive me if I ask to speak soon." To the captain, Elena asked, "To the cabin." Cynthia replied, "About what?" Cynthia smiled faintly. "About what happens when decency chooses to be silent, and what happens when one man refuses." Back in 2B, Malcolm opened his eyes. He saw the ripple now visible, growing, inescapable. Not chaos, not yet, but truth, unfolding, and just beneath it, the hum of something else, something powerful, a reckoning not driven by rage, but by refusal. Refusal to be moved, refusal to be erased, refusal to be silent. He placed a hand on the armrest and sat taller. He wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the truth. Cynthia Robbins didn't wait for permission. At 81 years old, she had long outgrown the need to be invited to speak. She stood slowly, pressing one hand to the headrest in front of her, and the other gripping the polished silver handle of her cane. Her posture was delicate but defiant. Her presence commanded stillness in the way only lived experience could. The whisper of her motion silenced half the cabin. Cynthia turned slightly, facing the row where Malcolm Royce sat. "May I?" she asked, gently. He nodded once. Then Cynthia turned to the rest of first class and spoke. "I am not here to make enemies," she began, "but I have lived long enough to know the sound of injustice when it arrives quietly. Every word landed, measured, clear, unapologetic. I have seen moments like this before. I've presided over courtrooms filled with people who thought silence was safety, that if you didn't speak, you couldn't be held responsible." She let the words breathe. "Let me be clear. This cabin is not confused. We know what happened. A man walked on, calm, respectful, dignified, and he was asked to leave his seat." Murmurs swirled now. Cynthia raised one hand gently, not to scold it to steady. I watched it unfold, and I stayed quiet, like too many of us did. And now, I will not do that again. She turned back toward Malcolm, her voice lowering. "Mr. Royce, thank you for teaching us all how stillness can speak louder than shouting." He met her gaze, a slight nod, nothing more, but it carried the weight of an entire nation's worth of restraint. Then Cynthia sat down again. No applause, no fanfare, just breath and silence and the sound of a wall cracking. Paige Whitmore sat frozen, her throat dry, her fingers twitching. She didn't look at Cynthia or Malcolm or anyone. She stared out the window like it could undo the last 40 minutes. But the whispers returned. Sharper now, less cautious. She could feel the distance grow between her and everyone else in the cabin, no longer protected by luxury or name or bag. Even the designer label that once sat proudly in her lap now felt like a weight she couldn't carry. Her seat felt smaller, her world quieter, her reputation shrinking. Helena Cruz stood at the galley, eyes damp. She hadn't cried, not quite, but she had felt something move through her when Cynthia spoke of permission. Maybe a mirror. She had let fear rule her instinct, let professionalism be an excuse for inaction. And now she stepped forward, not to Malcolm, but to Mark. "I want to log an official statement," she whispered. He turned. "What kind of statement? I want the incident entered on record," she said. "Word for word. I saw what happened, and I'm ready to say it." Mark blinked. She wasn't asking. He handed her a tablet, and Elena began typing. In 3C, Jared Banks scrolled through his phone in disbelief. The tweet had exploded. Thousands of shares. Articles already sprouting. Comments flooding in from across the country. Even international voices weighing in. One message stood out. "This is more than a seat. This is a mirror. And some people are finally seeing their reflection." He copied it, pasted it, and posted again. "To the man in 2B, thank you." Stillness speaks. Back at Regalia HQ, Victor Drummond's voice echoed across a massive strategy room. "Media is outpacing us. Get legal to draft a transparency statement. Do not deflect. Do not deny. And do not apologize for the delay. Apologize for the pattern." An executive raised his hand. "Do we suspend the flight crew?" "No," Victor said firmly. "We support the crew who spoke. Elena Cruz goes in front of every camera we can find." "What about the woman?" Victor looked down at the latest passenger manifest note. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. "If she refuses to make a statement, she'll be privately banned." And Royce Victor didn't hesitate. He stays seated. And the room understood. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the pivot. Malcolm sat quietly. He hadn't spoken in over 20 minutes. He didn't need to. Every movement around him told the story better than any interview ever could. The whisper of a woman's apology 2 rows back. The respectful glance from the businessman across the aisle. The way Elena had started writing something down, not for protocol, but for conscience. And most of all, the memory of Cynthia's voice. It stirred something in him. Something old. He remembered another time. He had been 26, new to Boston, young enough to still believe logic won over legacy. He'd walked into a pitch meeting. Clean suit, sharp numbers. The moment he introduced himself, one of the partners laughed and asked if he was there to deliver lunch. He'd smiled. He'd pitched anyway. He hadn't gotten the funding, but he had gotten something else. He had gotten used to being unseen. And even now, with $1 billion portfolio and influence that stretched from Washington to Shanghai, he still wasn't surprised by disbelief. But this was different, because for once, they had watched it happen. All of them, and this time, they couldn't pretend not to. The cockpit phone rang. Captain Reynolds picked up. "Yes, this is Victor Drummond," came the voice. "Mr. Royce is to be offered a direct line to our board chair. We are activating formal protocol for executive interference and initiating brand repair at the fleet level. You are to follow his lead from here on out." The captain blinked, then nodded. Understood. Malcolm's phone buzzed. A new text. From a number few people had, "Chairman Sato, Malcolm. The floor is yours. We've grounded the fleet. Your word decides our next step." Malcolm didn't reply. Not yet. He looked around the cabin, at the woman who had tried to erase him, at the strangers who had stayed silent, then found their voices, at the elder who had spoken truth when no one else would, and most of all, at the space he now occupied. Not because someone gave it to him, but because he had refused to leave it. Stillness wasn't a performance. It was a stance. And today, it had changed everything. Malcolm Royce had never asked to be a symbol. Symbols were easy to dehumanize. to flatten into headlines or hashtags. And yet, as he sat in seat 2B of Flight AV626, the weight pressing against his chest wasn't from altitude. It was from eyes, millions of them, watching, waiting. His phone buzzed again. Dozens of notifications, mentions, press calls, board members texting in carefully composed concern. The chair of Aerovista had already stepped back. The COO of Regalia had offered the reins, and now it was his move. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned his head back, eyes on the curved ceiling above, and let the low rumble of the plane fill the silence around him. It was a strange kind of power won, not claimed by force, but revealed in how others responded to your restraint. He thought of his father again, a man who had once said, "Power is not the ability to react. It's the ability to decide when not to." Malcolm had learned that the hard way, in meeting rooms where assumptions walked in before his resume, in boardrooms where silence followed every time he made a decision they didn't expect from someone like him. But this was different. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded compliance. He had sat down, and somehow that had rearranged the air in the room. Now he had to decide what came next. In the forward galley, Elena Cruz finished her written statement. Every word was deliberate, not legal, not safe, just honest. Mark Dellinger stood beside her, reading it in silence. "You're sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I need to get it right," she said. "Not for policy, for myself." He looked at her. Really looked this time, not as a subordinate, but as a fellow witness, a human being. "I'll file it directly," he said, but he didn't walk away immediately. Instead, he said, "Thank you for telling the truth, for risking discomfort, for remembering her humanity." Elena swallowed the lump in her throat. "Do you think he's going to do something?" she asked, meaning Malcolm. Mark exhaled. He already did. In 1D. Cynthia Robbins watched the cabin's atmosphere evolve like weather. The air had thickened with attention. Passengers had gone from whispering to reflecting. She could see it in their eyes, the shift from consumption to confrontation. They were confronting their own part in it. That was the hardest part of change, not acknowledging what happened, but admitting you saw it and said nothing. She reached for her notebook, not to write a statement, but to record the moment. Because moments like this didn't just belong to the media. They belonged to memory, to those who might need reminding later that dignity once took the shape of a quiet man in seat 2B. Paige Whitmore hadn't spoken in over an hour. Her phone rested in her lap. Screen dim. No one had texted her back. Not her fiancé. Not her PR handler. Not her cousin who worked in corporate compliance. She felt exposed. But what haunted her more than shame was clarity. Because the more she replayed it in her mind, the bag, the words she chose, the look on Malcolm's face, the more she realized she had been sure she would be protected. That's what privilege felt like. A safety net woven so tightly you never feared the fall. Until it vanished. And now she wasn't scared of being seen as a villain. She was scared of having been one the whole time. Back in 3C. Jared Banks stared at his phone, now vibrating every few seconds. His face had been plastered on news outlets that picked up his tweet. His DMs were flooded. One of the crew members from his startup had already texted Dude, "You're a movement now." He didn't feel like a movement. He felt like a guy who saw something wrong and said something small. And that small thing had lit a match. He looked toward Malcolm. What would he do? What does a man do when the world hands him a sword and begs him to swing? Carmen Lee, sitting in the West Coast control tower of Aerovista Holdings, knew the answer wasn't obvious. All systems were standing by. Protocol Halcyon had fully deployed. The global fleet had been slowed just enough to strain revenue without causing panic. Internal reports were streaming in. Policies, language, training materials were already being updated, but none of that would matter without Malcolm's decision. She didn't know what he would do, and that made her respect him more. Power used to be loud, but Malcolm had shown that sometimes real leadership sounded like stillness. Captain Reynolds approached the first-class cabin and stopped in front of Malcolm's seat. "Mr. Royce," he said quietly, "we're awaiting your instruction." Malcolm looked up. The moment stretched between them. Then he asked, "What's the current delay status?" 37 flights held, 17 temporarily grounded, system-wide pressure, but no cancellations yet. You've effectively paused an empire. Malcolm said nothing at first. "Then are they listening now?" The captain nodded. "Everyone is." Malcolm thought about that. He could make a speech. He could bring every reporter to the gate, sit behind a microphone, and name what happened. He could demand firings, policy overhauls, financial penalties. But would that change the thing beneath all of it? The belief that a black man in a suit still needed permission to sit in the seat he paid for, would rage undo that, or would resolve? He turned to Elena, who stood nearby. "May I borrow your notepad?" wordlessly. She handed it to him. He wrote one sentence, then folded it and handed it to the captain. "This is what I want read," Malcolm said. "Before the doors close." The captain accepted the note, unfolded it, and read. His face didn't change, but something softened. "I'll make sure it's heard," he said. 10 minutes later, the overhead chime rang. The captain's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we begin our journey, I'd like to share a message from one of our passengers." A pause. Then he read Malcolm's words. "Sometimes the most radical thing a man can do is refuse to leave the seat he rightfully owns. Let this be the last flight where that has to be proven." A hush settled, then a wave of breath, some from relief, some from reckoning, some from finally hearing what had gone unsaid for too long. Malcolm closed his eyes. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. He had reclaimed the seat. But more importantly, he had let it echo. And now, the world would have to decide what to do with the sound. The engines ignited with a low, steady roar. Flight AV626 finally pulled back from the gate. To the outside world, it looked like any other delayed departure. But inside the cabin, every person aboard knew the truth. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a message in motion. And the man in seat 2B who had not shouted, had not threatened, had not stormed down the aisle, had just changed the air 30,000 feet above the clouds. As the wheels left the ground, a subtle silence filled the space between safety briefings and cabin announcements. But it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of realization. Malcolm Royce stared out the window as the skyline of Charleston shrank behind them. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired. Not physically, but emotionally. The weight of being the one who had to hold composure. Again. The weight of being made to represent not just himself, but history. In seat 3C, Jared Banks typed another post, "Flight finally airborne." But something heavier than luggage took off today. Well, Malcolm Royce. The seat. He stared at it for a moment before pressing send. He looked around the cabin. Passengers who once scrolled social media now just sat, many in silence, some glancing toward Malcolm as if seeing him for the first time, not as the subject of a story, but as a man. In seat 4A, an older couple leaned toward one another. "I feel ashamed," the woman whispered. "We just watched it." and didn't say a word. Her husband nodded slowly. "We've done that before, haven't we?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. They had too many times. Even the flight attendants were different now. Their steps slower, more deliberate, their voices softer. It wasn't about fear. It was about respect. Elena Cruz offered Malcolm a glass of water. No plastic cup. No dismissiveness. Just a simple, quiet handoff. He accepted with a soft, "Thank you." And she gave a small nod, as if to say, "I see you now." Back on the ground, headlines were stacking like dominoes. Black CEO quietly reclaimed seat. Shakes industry flight, AV626. A new civil rights moment. Malcolm Royce speaks without shouting, and the world listens. Carmen Lee stood in the central ops room at Aerovista's West Coast HQ, reviewing live feeds. She turned to her team. "No damage control," she said. "No filters. No PR language. Let this speak for itself." One junior strategist looked up. "You mean, don't spin it?" Carmen shook her head. "Royce didn't spin anything. Neither should we." She picked up her phone and texted the chairman. "The industry is watching, and more importantly, so is the public." In a high-rise office across New York, boardroom lights glowed late into the afternoon. Investor groups, legal consultants, and DEI strategists sat around long tables, all watching the same clip, the captain reading Malcolm's single sentence over the intercom. No rage, no legal jargon, just a man asking that his rightful seat be respected. It was harder to defend against that than any lawsuit, because dignity had its own frequency. And now, companies were scrambling to tune in. Meanwhile, in her seat, Paige Whitmore was still. No makeup adjustment, no Instagram scrolling, no smug glances. She stared down at her hands and thought of her mother, a woman who once told her, "If you can't sit beside someone, you don't belong above them." She had ignored that advice for years, framing it as softness, weakness, but now she saw it for what it was. Wisdom. Too late to take back what she said, but maybe not too late to begin unlearning. Across the aisle, Cynthia Robbins leaned back with a pen in her hand. She had already drafted an op-ed in her mind, not about Malcolm, but about the people who watched him and how their silence was its own form of participation. Her title, "We All Had a Seat. We Just Didn't Take It." She'd publish it the moment wheels touched down, because moments like this weren't meant to be buried in news cycles. They were meant to echo. Malcolm kept his eyes on the clouds. From here, the world looked soft, but he knew better. He knew change wasn't soft. It was uncomfortable, uneven, slow. But he also knew something else. Moments matter. Even if they seem small, even if no one claps, even if you sit in silence, refusing to move when someone says, "You don't belong here," especially then. He thought about his team, about the young intern back in Chicago who once asked him, "How do you stay so calm when people disrespect you?" And he remembered what he'd told her. "You don't calm down. You center. You don't lose your fire. You focus it." And now that fire had lit something, he hadn't expected a reckoning that didn't roar, but rang. In the rear of the plane, a passenger pressed the call button. When Elena arrived, he whispered, "I'd like to change my seat. If he's comfortable with it, I'd like to sit beside Mr. Royce." Elena blinked. "Why?" He smiled awkwardly. "I just think maybe it's time I sat next to someone I used to overlook." Elena nodded. "I'll ask." She walked forward. And for the first time that flight, a smile played faintly at the edge of her lips. 37,000 feet in the air, Malcolm Royce wasn't trying to lead a movement. He wasn't interested in viral fame. He just wanted to finish a flight in peace. But the truth, he had started something bigger. Because justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits down. Sometimes it refuses to move. Sometimes it just breathes, and everyone else learns to adjust around it. When Flight AV626 touched down in Chicago, the wheels met the runway with a calm thud. The passengers didn't erupt in applause. There was no clapping, no cheers, just silence, the kind that comes not from tension, but from reverence, the kind that follows a shift in perspective. Malcolm Royce stayed seated until the seatbelt sign turned off. He did not rush. He never did. He waited. Not just because he was the last off, as protocol required for VIP protection, but because he needed the pause. He needed to remember what the seat had cost him and what it had just given back to the world. Elena Cruz came by one last time, her eyes softer than when they met hours ago. "Thank you," she said simply. He met her gaze. For what? For staying. She whispered. He nodded. Sometimes that was enough. Outside Gate C-12, the crowd had gathered press, travelers, airport staff, onlookers who had followed the story from their phones mid-journey. A security escort waited, but Malcolm requested something else. "I'd like to exit through the main terminal." They hesitated. It wasn't procedure. Still, no one argued. He walked slowly, briefcase in hand, through the glass corridor as cameras flashed, but he didn't stop. He didn't speak, because he wasn't a spectacle. He was a signal, and the signal had already been sent. Across the country, university campuses were buzzing. In New York, a professor stopped mid-lecture to ask her students, "What does it mean when someone makes change without raising their voice?" In Atlanta, a group of first-year law students replayed the cabin recording of the captain reading Malcolm's note over and over, parsing its power. In Los Angeles, a group of students walked into their business ethics seminar wearing T-shirts that read, "Take the seat, hold the line." In a quiet cafe in Milwaukee, a man sat reading the news article. He had worked as a pilot for 17 years. He had seen plenty of misconduct, most of it small, subtle, unspoken. A refusal to greet certain passengers. A quick glance at someone's skin before checking their name. But today, he'd printed out Malcolm's quote and taped it above his locker. Sometimes the most radical thing a man can do is refuse to leave the seat he rightfully owns. He read it once, every morning now, and every night before he flew. Back in Chicago, Carmen Lee watched the analytics spike in real time. The social engagement had surpassed expectations. But more than that, calls from leadership were different now. Less defensive, more reflective. Even the Regalia Board, who had braced for crisis, had begun to shift tone. One board member said, "We expected noise. What we got was clarity." Another said, "This isn't just about PR anymore. It's about policy." Carmen leaned back and smiled faintly. That's what Malcolm always taught her when she worked under him years ago. Don't just protect the company, protect its reflection. At his hotel, Malcolm unpacked in silence. He had no intention of holding a press conference, no intention of tweeting. His presence had already done enough. But as he sat near the window, he noticed something. Across the street, at the edge of the sidewalk, stood a boy. Maybe 10, maybe 11. Skinny, holding a sign made out of notebook paper. It said, in big scribbled letters, "Thank you for not getting up." Malcolm blinked. The boy didn't wave, didn't shout. He just stood there, still, like he understood something most adults still didn't. Malcolm stood slowly, moved to the window, placed his palm on the glass, and the boy, in turn, lifted his hand matching it from the other side of the street. No sound passed between them, but the message was clear. You stayed, so I could see what that looks like. Later that night, in a boardroom several floors above Regalia's flagship terminal, Victor Drummond stood before executives and shareholders. We can't go back, he said. No one interrupted. No more window dressing. No more reactionary training sessions. He gestured to the large screen behind him, Malcolm's face frozen mid-walk, exiting the terminal in silence. This is the future. It doesn't shout. It doesn't break things, but it shifts everything. An older board member leaned in. What are you proposing? Victor replied. We don't fix the PR. We fix the root, culture, policy, structure. And we start with the question, what would have happened if Malcolm wasn't famous? A hush fell over the room, because they all knew the answer, and they all knew it wasn't good enough. In his hotel suite, Malcolm finally sat down, not to respond, not to plan, but to reflect. He thought of the student-led protests forming already. He thought of the new clause being added to Regalia's employee manual that would ban preemptive receding without passenger consent or clear behavioral rationale. He thought of Carmen, of Elena, of Cynthia, of everyone who had found their voice that day because he had not raised his. He opened his notebook, the one he kept with him on every trip, and on a new page, he wrote, maybe the seat was never about flying. Maybe it was always about landing. He closed the notebook. Then he finally turned off his phone. Because tonight, he didn't need to speak. The world was still echoing. 2 days after Flight AV626 landed in Chicago, the phrase "hold the seat" appeared on a school bulletin board in Detroit. It wasn't written by a teacher or administrator. It was scribbled by a 7th grader named Isaiah using a blue Sharpie. He didn't know all the details, but he knew someone who looked like him stayed seated when people tried to erase him, and that meant something. His history teacher noticed. She didn't erase it. She circled it, and under it, she wrote in chalk, "We'll talk about this tomorrow. Bring your thoughts." By morning, half the school knew the story, and by afternoon, they weren't just learning history. They were realizing it was still being written. In Washington, a closed-door roundtable meeting was underway. Attendees included CEOs from 5 major airlines, 2 federal transportation advisors, and one guest, Carmen Lee. Carmen wasn't there to charm or to scold. She was there to present a new model for passenger equity, co-drafted by her team and quietly reviewed by Malcolm Royce himself. One advisor interrupted her early on. Do you believe this was a racial incident or a class incident? Carmen looked at him, calm. I believe, she said slowly, that what happened to Malcolm Royce was about pattern. And patterns are always worth confronting, whether they make you uncomfortable or not. The room grew still, because the truth was no longer avoidable. In Los Angeles, a well-known luxury designer released a statement attempting to distance their brand from the Karen bag incident. It was hollow. People noticed. The company's stock dropped 2.7% within hours. In response, activists organized a quiet protest outside their Beverly Hills storefront. Dozens of people sat in folding chairs on the sidewalk, not chanting, not holding signs, just sitting, in suits, in sneakers, in silence. They called it the seat in. Meanwhile, Regalia Airlines had initiated the most aggressive reform in its 42-year history, led by Victor Drummond and approved unanimously by the board. The initiative included immediate review of all customer escalation protocols, Mandatory training on identity bias in first class and executive lounges. A 3-year partnership with educational groups to develop empathy-based scenario learning. A published public apology, not just for the incident, but for the years of institutional blind spots that preceded it. The document wasn't signed by legal, it was signed by every executive, including Carmen, and one additional line at the end, added by Victor personally. Sometimes leadership is not about speaking louder. It's about making sure those who've been quiet too long are finally heard. Malcolm read it quietly from his apartment. He didn't smile, but he did feel something shift inside him. Not pride, not vindication, just relief, like something heavy had been set down. That afternoon, his assistant handed him a plain envelope. It had no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. He opened it slowly. Inside was a note, handwritten on thick ivory stationery. It said, "Your stillness moved more than noise ever could. I was wrong. I know that now." Page, no fanfare, no long defense, just honesty. And maybe that was enough. He folded the letter, placed it inside his notebook, not for safekeeping, but for remembering. Later that week, he returned to Chicago's South Side, where he had once mentored students through a local nonprofit. They had requested his presence not as a CEO, not even as a news figure, just as a man. He walked into the small auditorium, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in jeans and a sweater. The students stood. He waved them down. "Please," he said gently, "don't stand because the world did. Stand when you see yourselves." The room hushed. One girl, maybe 12, raised her hand. "Did you plan it?" she asked. "The sitting thing," Malcolm smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but I chose it." A pause. Sometimes the moment chooses you, and you just have to decide what kind of echo you want to leave behind. That stayed with them, more than any headline, more than any viral clip, because it gave them agency, not just admiration. Outside, the boy from the street corner waited again. Same sidewalk, same quiet posture, but this time, Malcolm approached him, up close. The boy was even younger than he remembered. "Hey," Malcolm said, crouching slightly. "You came back." The boy nodded. "I wanted to know," he whispered. "Did it feel scary?" Malcolm thought carefully before answering. "Yes," he said. "A little. Why'd you stay?" Malcolm looked at him, really looked. So that one day, you wouldn't have to ask that question anymore. The boy's eyes filled just slightly. He reached into his backpack and handed Malcolm a drawing. It was crayon, a plane, a window seat, and a man sitting in it. Above it, in shaky lettering, were the words still strong. Malcolm folded the paper. This one, he didn't put in his briefcase. He held it. All the way home. That night, a documentary producer reached out to his office. Malcolm declined. He didn't want his face on every screen. He wanted his silence to remain loud. Because if people remembered the action, not the man, maybe more would feel empowered to act next time. Somewhere, on a new flight. A young black father helped his daughter into a window seat in first class. When the flight attendant approached, she looked at them, smiled, and said, "Welcome aboard. Let me know if there's anything you need." No tension, no questions, just service, just normal. The man leaned back in his seat, breathing deeply. His daughter looked at him and asked, "Did you see what happened with that man on the plane?" He nodded. "He's the reason we're here," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She already knew. The elevator opened on the 38th floor of Aerovista Holdings. Malcolm Royce stepped out, briefcase in hand, and walked past the familiar brushed steel logo mounted on the wood-paneled wall. For years, this hallway had held the faint scent of ambition cool air, leather chairs, and cologne that tried too hard to prove something. Now, it felt different. People didn't look away. They didn't avert their gaze or smile too brightly in performative discomfort. They simply nodded, acknowledged, and let the silence speak for itself. In the boardroom, 12 directors waited. Most were seated already, papers aligned, screens open. Carmen Lee stood at the far end, watching the door. When Malcolm entered, she offered no grand gesture, no introduction. She simply said, "He's here." And every conversation in the room stopped. Malcolm didn't sit at the head of the table. He chose the middle, and without needing to raise his voice, the meeting began. Victor Drummond leaned forward first. "We wanted to share where we are," he began. "Following your message and your actions, Regalia has restructured our first-class training program, updated language protocols, and opened a permanent seat at this table for a passenger advocate." He tapped a folder in front of him. "We'd like that seat to be yours. If you'll accept it." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a symbolic role?" he asked softly. "Or a real one?" Victor hesitated only for a moment. A real one. There was no pride in his tone, just respect. Malcolm didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the room. These were the same directors who had once questioned his strategies, the same ones who had reviewed his credentials 3 times before, approving a single contract. The same ones who smiled, but always seemed to ask, "Is he ready and now?" For the first time. They were the ones waiting. Across from him, an older board member cleared her throat. "I want to say something," she said. "I've been in this business 36 years, and in that time, I've watched a lot of men shout to be heard, demand to be respected. You didn't do that." Malcolm said nothing. "I used to believe strength came from presence," she continued, "but watching the world respond to your stillness, I think I understand now. Presence isn't about volume. It's about gravity." She looked down, then back at him. "You changed our center of gravity." The room was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was full. Carmen spoke next. She pulled a printed photo from a folder and slid it across the table toward Malcolm. It was the boy from the sidewalk, the one who had stood across the street with the "thank you for not getting up" sign. Malcolm looked at it. She said, "His name is Elijah. He's 10. His teacher wrote us, said the incident helped him speak for the first time in class." Malcolm blinked slowly. There had been no speeches, no press conferences, just a seat, and the choice to keep it. That was all. But for a boy named Elijah, it had been enough. "There's more," Carmen continued. "We've been approached by 3 major universities. They want to build a case study around this moment, not as an example of crisis, but of quiet leadership." She looked directly at him. "They're calling it the Royce model." He exhaled slowly. He hadn't wanted his name on anything. But if it helped someone else one day hold their ground, maybe that was enough. After the meeting, as the directors left one by one, Carmen remained. She poured him a cup of tea. "Do you know," she said, handing it to him, "that after all this, the woman Paige, she asked to meet with you." He accepted the tea, thoughtful. "Will you?" He looked at her. "No," he said gently. "Not because I'm angry, but because the lesson isn't about me forgiving her. It's about her changing anyway." Carmen nodded. "You've always believed that," she said. He smiled faintly. "I've always hoped for it." Later that afternoon, Malcolm walked through the company cafeteria. A young intern approached him nervously. "Mr. Royce," she asked. "Yes, I just wanted to say. I was on that flight. I was in economy. I saw everything." He studied her face. "You stayed seated," she said, "even when they tried to move you." He waited. "I just want you to know," she said, voice cracking slightly, "because you did. I'm not afraid to speak up in meetings anymore." He nodded and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Keep your seat," he said, "and make sure others can keep theirs too." At the end of the day, he returned to his office, the same one he had designed years ago, with windows overlooking the city and a wall filled with framed contracts and awards. But now, he noticed something. On his desk sat a new plaque, unlabeled, unadorned, just a seat, carved in wood. Beside it, a note. "Thank you for holding the space long enough for others to find their voice." No signature, just truth. He sat in his chair, not the one on the plane, not the one at the head of the boardroom, just his own. And as the sun dipped low over the skyline, he allowed himself one deep breath of stillness, not because the work was over, but because it had finally begun. And for once, the world wasn't just watching, it was listening. 6 weeks later, Malcolm Royce was at the airport again. No entourage, no announcement, no boardroom destination. He wore a plain gray blazer, navy shirt, dark jeans, and no tie. He walked calmly, pulling a single carry-on bag behind him. He had booked the flight himself, online. No VIP alert, no special tags, just a man boarding a plane. He wasn't testing the system. He wasn't proving a point. He simply wanted to see if the world had changed, or at least, if it had started to. The terminal looked the same. High ceilings, wide windows, a steady stream of announcements cutting through a soft buzz of movement. But as he moved through the TSA line, something different happened. The agent checking IDs looked up, paused, and nodded, not out of recognition, but out of understanding. Malcolm returned the nod. No words passed between them, but the moment spoke volumes. Gate B18 was quiet. No crowds, just the occasional traveler scrolling through phones, sipping overpriced coffee. Malcolm took a seat near the window. He didn't need the lounge today. He just wanted to sit with the people. Across from him sat a young black woman holding a baby. She bounced the child gently on her knee and smiled when their eyes met. "I think she likes your voice," the woman said. Malcolm chuckled. "I haven't said anything." The woman grinned. "Exactly. Stillness has a sound." He let the words linger, because she wasn't wrong. When boarding began, the agent called zones, just as always. Malcolm's seat was 2A, first class. He waited until his group was called. No one asked to see extra identification. No one questioned the name on the screen. When he reached the doorway, the flight attendant smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Royce." She didn't overdo it. She didn't ignore him either. Just saw him. And that was enough. He settled into his seat and exhaled. Out the window, the sky was clear, not a storm in sight. Across the aisle sat a teenager typing on a tablet. After a few minutes, the boy looked up and leaned over. "Excuse me," he said quietly. You're the guy from the flight, right? The one who—" Malcolm gave a small smile. "Yes." The boy nodded, wide-eyed. "My civics teacher showed us the video. You didn't even say much. You just didn't move." He hesitated. "That was cool." Malcolm chuckled softly. Sometimes, holding your place is the most powerful thing you can do. The boy nodded again. Can I ask you something? Sure. What did it feel like when they told you to move? Malcolm paused. He didn't answer right away. I've been asked to move my whole life, he said slowly. That day just happened to have an audience. The boy thought about that, then sat back in his seat. Thank you, he said quietly. Malcolm turned back to the window, but inside, something softened. Because this was legacy, not policies, not hashtags, but understanding, passed from one mind to another. As the plane ascended, Malcolm closed his eyes. He didn't need the in-flight service. He didn't need anything. For the first time in a long while, he felt something rare. Not relief, not vindication, just peace. In the rows behind him, a group of high schoolers whispered. One of them passed a small notebook forward. The one in the middle seat flipped to a page and showed it to her friends. It was a drawing of a man in a seat, with the words, "Never give up your place, just because it makes others comfortable." The plane leveled out. In the galley, the flight crew spoke in hushed tones. One of them mentioned how the new seating policy had led to fewer conflicts, more dignity, fewer passengers feeling watched. Another talked about how they now go through empathy briefings, not just security procedures, and all of them agreed it wasn't perfect. But it was different, because now there was awareness, and awareness, once born, rarely dies. Back on the ground, in offices and schools and homes across the country, Malcolm's story was still circulating, but no longer as news. Now, it was being folded into training modules. It was being quoted at graduations. It was discussed at dinner tables. And slowly, it stopped being his story. It became ours. A reminder that dignity is not something you wait to be handed. It's something you quietly insist upon. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Seattle. Weather is calm. Winds are light. There was a pause. Then the captain added, and today, we'd like to acknowledge a very special passenger on board, Mr. Malcolm Royce. Heads turned. A few passengers clapped, gently. Malcolm didn't raise a hand. He didn't stand. He just nodded once. The captain continued, Mr. Royce reminded us all that leadership doesn't always look like a title or a press release. Sometimes, it just looks like sitting down and not moving when it matters most. The plane dipped gently through the clouds. Malcolm turned his eyes once more to the sky. This time, the sky remembered him, and more importantly, he remembered himself. Not as a CEO, not as a symbol, but as a man who stayed seated, so others could finally stand. Sometimes the loudest voices say nothing at all. Malcolm Royce didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just stayed seated. And in doing so, he reminded the world that power doesn't always come from speaking louder, but from standing firmly in who you are, even when you're sitting down. His story isn't just about one flight, one seat, or one injustice. It's about the millions who have been asked to move, to wait, to prove their worth before being treated with dignity. It's about what changes when one person says, "Not this time." And it's about the ripples across classrooms, boardrooms, and airport gates that follow quiet courage. If this story moved you, if you believe every person deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with humanity, no matter their seat, share it, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and stay with us for more stories that challenge silence, confront injustice, and honor the quiet power within us all. Because sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is simply not move. Thank you for watching.